Hello, welcome to Narrative Drivetime, a show about storytelling with the best storytellers in the world. And we have a treat for you today. Bob Kendrick is the president of the Negro League Baseball Museum and one of the best storytellers I've ever been around. I've been enjoying his work for the last few weeks and for the last few years. We're going to talk today about the importance of history, the importance of storytelling, and the role the Negro League Baseball Museum plays in all of that. Bob, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, Craig, it's my pleasure, man. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a true pleasure for me. So let's talk right off the bat about history. History has never been more important in my lifetime right now. We are starting to see histories that have been ignored or repressed over a long period of time starting to come to light. Mm-hmm. You know, the President Biden acknowledged the Tulsa massacre. In Canada, where I live, the residential school tragedy is dominating the news and helping us rethink the way we think about Canada. What role does the Negro League Baseball Museum play in the rediscovery of history for a lot of people?
I think it's just that. It is an awakening for most of the people who come to visit the Negro League Baseball Museum, because this was once an untold chapter of baseball and American history. And so folks who come here are, I think, amazed by what they learn. But to be quite frank, Craig, I think a little bit dismayed by the fact that they just now had an opportunity to learn this. You do leave questioning, why didn't I know this during my own formal education? And the answer, as we both know, is pretty simple. American historians, man, did us a tremendous disservice. They kept this wonderful chapter of baseball and Americana away from us. Thusly, countless generations of us went through our own formal educations without knowing one of the most significant chapters. Again, not in baseball history, but American history. And that's the rich, compelling, inspirational story of the Negro Leagues. And so we've given voice to this story that had literally toiled in anonymity for so long. And we're proud to do so. We're proud to bring that story to life.
Well, I mean, you nailed it right on the head. The history of baseball is kind of the history of America, and the changes that happened in the mid to late 20th century didn't come out of a lot of social movements initially. They came out of baseball.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what I tell people all the time. The Negro Leagues, in essence, was really the kind of first sports activists. You know, their mindset was pretty doggone rigid in the fact that if you won't let me play with you, I'll create my own. You know, that's how I will combat that. I'm not going to dwell and pout and cry. This is not a woe is mine kind of story.
There's no crying in baseball, right?
Yeah, no, they didn't cry about the social injustice. They went out and did something about it. You won't let me play with you? I create my own. But as you well know, that is the American way. And I think that's why this story grabs hold of folks the way that it does, because even though America was trying to prevent them from sharing in the so-called joys of her national pastime, it was the American spirit that allowed them to persevere and prevail. And there is something indeed very triumphant about that story. And you feel that when you come to the Negro League Baseball Museum. When you leave here, I truly believe that our guests leave cheering the power of the human spirit to persevere and prevail.
Well, it's such an interesting story and organization because, I mean, it's wonderful that it existed. It's tragic that it had to exist. Mm-hmm. There's a real dichotomy in that story. How is that represented at the museum?
Well, and I think you hit the nail right on the head. And this is what I remind people of all the time. The circumstances that created a need for a Negro League is sad. It is sorrowful. Segregation is one of the shameful periods in this country's history. But the Negro Leagues themselves, there's nothing sad or sorrowful about this story. Mm-hmm. It's a celebration, and we treat it as such. And again, it is the celebration of the power of the human spirit to persevere and prevail. you had a certain mindset that said, we will do this. You cannot diminish our ability to play this game. We're good at it. We want the world to see how good we are at it. And so that's what they did. They were determined to play this game, the game that they love. And their passion for this game would not only change the sport, but ultimately it would change our country for the better. And that is how this story is told here at the Negro League Baseball Museum.
Well, one of the real ironies in the story of the Negro Leagues is, they created an opportunity for not just African American players to play, but Latinos to play. There's a Jewish team that's featured prominently in your display, which is wonderful. But they created this place for these great players of skill to play, which gave us Jackie Robinson going into the major leagues and integrating, which created the demise of the Negro Leagues.
As one of our films that we used to show here, and former CNN anchorman Bernard Shaw kind of summarized it best. Craig, he said, you might say that the Negro Leagues were so good that they put themselves out of business. And so, it was exactly how you just described. And so when Jackie breaks the color barrier, you had all this talent that was there in the Negro Leagues, and people were starting to identify that there was more than major league caliber talent there in the Negro Leagues. And if somebody's bold enough to bring it in, it's going to change this game. But in doing so, it killed the Negro Leagues. And with it, we saw the demise of many African American communities across this country. Because wherever you had successful Black baseball, you typically had thriving Black economies. And because so many of these businesses had emerged to meet need, and Negro Leagues baseball was bringing them a built-in clientele that led those businesses to their economic heights. When we lost that catalyst, we witnessed the demise of many urban communities across this country.
What from that story can people take away now?
Well, I think, as I said, people come here and what they do is they learn, number one, segregation summarized through the eyes of a child. And as you can well imagine, our outreach is specifically targeting a lot of children. We want everybody to encounter the story, but it is really important that our children are introduced to the story. And segregation summarized through the eyes of a child is done so very simply. That was dumb. And they're right. It was dumb. And what this story does is it makes segregation appear to be even more ludicrous than we already knew it to be. And one of my favorite posters in our gift shop, the headline on the poster says, 420 feet is 420 feet, no matter what color your skin is. And so think that the color of one's skin could dictate whether or not they could play this game made no sense then. It makes even less sense now, and that comes across. But I think what you also identify here with is the American spirit. This story embodies the annals of the American spirit. I should say this story embodies the American spirit as much as any story in the annals of American history. You think about this. It is everything we pride ourselves about being American. Because, Craig, it is about pride. It's about passion. It's about perseverance. It is about determination. It is about courage. And those things are things that we absolutely pride ourselves about what's great about this country. And it's all embodied inside this wonderful story of the Negro League and these amazingly courageous athletes who, as I like to say, forged a glorious history in the midst of an inglorious time in American history. And that comes across very triumphantly when you go through the Negro League Baseball Museum. And that's why I always say, what's not to love about the story of the Negro League? And I don't think there was a time that people didn't want to know about the story of the Negro League. They just had no way to know about the story of the Negro League because it's not documented in the pages of American history books. And so it is our job as a cultural institution to bring this story to the forefront. And people are responding in tremendous ways once they are introduced to this story.
Well, uh, you talk about the importance of this story and the museum and how it hasn't been recorded, but certainly one of the great breakthroughs in my time of the story of the Negro League was Ken Burns' baseball documentary, and you know exactly where I'm going with this. Buck O'Neil
Yeah.
stole the show everybody, from everybody with his ability, his joy of existence. And second, his ability to really tell a story and make it come to life and make you care about him and his stories. How important has Buck O'Neil been to the history of the Negro Leagues?
Oh, extremely important. In many ways, he became the voice of the Negro Leagues through his compelling narration in Ken Burns' epic documentary on the history of baseball. But what Ken did, because there were other great Negro League documentaries out there long before Ken dedicated that portion of that series to the Negro Leagues, but what Ken gave it was a mainstream voice. And there was Buck O'Neil, as I like to describe him, Craig, as this very charming, gentle man who was telling these wonderful stories about baseball to baseball fans that they'd never heard before. And man, he did it with a twinkle in his eye and a smile that lit up the screen, and America fell in love with Buck. He was 82 years old at that time. And Buck used to tell me, he says, Bob, I've been telling these stories for 40 years and nobody ever listened. And Ken Burns gave him a platform and people listened. And then God blessed him for another 12 years as he was literally gallivanting across this country, preaching the gospel of the Negro Leagues and the virtues of his museum to any and everyone who would listen. And guess who was along for the ride? Old Bob. I'm hanging on his coattail the entire way. And so I guess you could call me a disciple of Buck O'Neil because now I get to preach the gospel of the Negro Leagues and the virtues of Buck's Museum to any and everybody who will listen. And I do that every day, and I do it proudly. But his ability to shape that story and what he would oftentimes talk about, what Ken did, unlike others, he said other people wanted him to tell the story the way they thought the story should be told. Ken said, I wasn't there. You tell the story the way you remember the story. And what did it do? It gave it true authenticity. And like you say, Buck absolutely stole the show. I will never forget the headline in the Kansas City Star right after his premiere in baseball says, a star is born at 82.
And he was a star, right? He was one of the stars of the Negro Leagues, and he'd formed the museum. He was a star already, but certainly he went to another level when
Oh, it
people.
was stratospheric after that. You know, he had been a big star in the Negro League, big star. But he was an even bigger star than he'd ever been after the Burns series.
Who? What other stories from the Negro Leagues do you think really represent what that experience was about?
Well, the thing that I like to tout a lot is the global impact of the Negro Leagues. Because quite frankly, they didn't care what color you were, they didn't care what gender you were. All they cared was can you play and do you have something to offer? And so it surprises so many of our visitors when they come here and they learn about the barnstorming antics of the Negro Leagues, where they would take baseball into Canada. They were oftentimes the first Americans to play in many Spanish speaking countries. And when we went to those countries, we were treated like heroes. We're staying in the finest hotels. We're eating in the finest restaurants that those countries had to offer. And man, you come back home and you're being treated like a second class citizen. So as a result, so many of those Negro League players would call those Spanish speaking countries home for one simple reason. In those countries, they weren't black baseball players. They were just baseball players. That's all they ever wanted to be. And so it created this brotherhood, so to speak, between black and brown that was bonded by baseball, or as they say in Spanish, baseball. And so it is a universal story. It is a global story, and the Negro Leagues were at the forefront of creating the global impact. Touring team of Negro Leaguers that go to Japan in 1927. Man, that's years before Babe Ruth and his All-Stars go to Japan. Yet they've been the ones who have been commonly credited with having taken professional baseball to the Japanese. But we now know that there was a team called the Philadelphia Royal Giants that go to Japan in 1927 and play a 24-game exhibition series. They go 23-0-1 on the tour. The tour was so successful that several years later, Ruth and his All-Stars could visit. And in essence, this team of Negro League players became early U.S. ambassadors. The Japanese absolutely adored those players because they didn't go over there and try to beat them as bad as they could. They taught them the game. And as you know, Japan is a country that respect is of utmost importance. And so the Negro Leaguers understood that. They were accustomed to barnstorming. Contrary is what happened when Ruth and his All-Stars go over. They did exactly what people would have expected the Negro League players to do. But the Negro League players were accustomed to barnstorming. They already knew that you don't ride into the town, beat the local town team as bad as you can. Why? Because that's a payday, man. You want to get invited back. And it wasn't really quite the same for the major leaguers. They didn't need it as much, I guess, as the Negro leaguers. And so as a result, the Japanese fans and players absolutely adored those ball players.
Now, that's not by any stretch of the imagination the only things that the Negro Leagues pioneered. First, to play games under the lights.
Yes.
That was a big one. And, I saw in one of your videos, it had such an effect, it affected the start of church on Sunday.
Oh, it absolutely did. When we talk about the advents that come from the Negro Leagues, the batting helmet, shin guards, and as you mentioned, night baseball. The Negro Leagues would introduce night baseball 5 years before the major leaguers ever played under lights. Now, the history book obviously tells us that the first professional night baseball game, 1935, Crossley Field, Cincinnati, Ohio, Cincinnati Reds versus the Philadelphia Phillies. Well, the history book is wrong. The first professional night baseball game, 1930, and it featured our very own Kansas City Monarchs. J.L. Wilkinson, who owned the Monarchs, literally mortgaged everything he had to pioneer night baseball, portable generated light towers. So not only could they play a night game in Kansas City, they could load them up on the truck and play virtually a night game anywhere. Truth of the matter is, by the time they played that game in Cincinnati, the Monarchs on a team called the House of David had taken night baseball all the way out to Seattle. But as you kind of referred, Wilkie wasn't doing this to be innovative. He was doing it for survival. You see, back then, the Negro Leagues were primarily relegated to playing on Sundays. Major League Baseball really didn't play on Sundays. So the Negro Leagues would rent the ballpark, play that Sunday doubleheader. Black folks left church, going straight to the ballpark, dressed to the nines, as we would like to say. And Wilkie was looking for a way to get the working class fan into the ballpark. Night baseball became the answer. Night baseball became bigger than Sunday games. And Sunday games, as you mentioned, were so popular that black churches would move their service time up an hour so fans could go to the game. Now, if you know anything about the black church, you don't mess with service time. 11 o'clock Sunday go to meeting. When the Monarchs were home, service started at 10 o'clock, and everybody filed out going to that Sunday doubleheader. Night baseball was even bigger than that. But as I tell my guests, here's where the fallacy occurs. American historians never viewed Negro Leagues baseball as having been professional. Thus, the major leagues could get credited for something that had happened 5 years before. And so it is important that we set the record straight. But you know what, Craig? I think that people want the truth. We do. We want the truth. And so for so long, the truth had been denied. And I can tell you now, to a person that comes to this museum, they do not like the fact that someone arbitrarily tried to decide what you and I know. As Americans, we don't take too kindly to that. And the fact that American historians, they literally did us all a disservice. They kept this wonderful piece of baseball and Americana away from us. And it was done deliberately, and so we are here now to fill in the gaps of the pages of American history books because there are so many who have contributed to the greatness of this country. And their stories have really never been told, certainly not told and put into its proper perspective. The Negro Leagues were one of those great stories.
Well, I love the idea that everybody wants the truth, but there is great opposition to teaching, people talk. You hear a lot of people trying to rewrite history. It's not rewriting history.
No,
It's
no,
filling in the history that you were never
exactly.
told about in the first place. I think, and one bit of history, I don't want to go too much about this because there's something else I want to talk about. One piece of history that I didn't know about is there were 3 women that played in the Negro Leagues. That's a pioneering story that nobody knows about. But when you talk about correcting the history books, or you didn't put it that way, but I am. I thought the biggest day in sports last year was a day when no games were played. And that was the day when the Negro League's records were integrated with the Major League Baseball records to create to solve a huge problem and put the greatest players of the Negro Leagues in the same categories. When you're scrolling through, you'll see them with the same players of the major leagues. What players are the big winners when that happens?
Well, there are a number. And you're right. It was truly a historic day last December when Major League Baseball made the epic announcement that they were at long last recognizing the Negro Leagues for exactly what we already knew them to be, a major league, and that they would then roll into the annals of baseball, Major League Baseball's history, the stats of the Negro Leagues as part of this recognition. And so that was truly historic. I think the guys who will benefit the most from this, oddly enough, are those players who were crossover players, players who bridge both the Negro Leagues and the Major Leagues, because their numbers will likely improve dramatically. So, for instance, a guy like my dear friend, the late great Monty Irvin, who was like a 297 lifetime hitter in Major League Baseball. Now, reminding people that he didn't get to the Major Leagues until he was 30 years old. And he still puts up a great stretch, at such an old age for a ball player. I wish Major League Baseball would have gotten Monty Irvin when he was 19, 20 years old, when there was nothing that he couldn't do. But Monty spent a considerable amount of time with the Newark Eagles. And so now he will move over that 300 threshold. And, even though 297 is just 3/10 of a point off of 300, people look at you differently. They look at you entirely differently as a hitter when you get to that 300 threshold as opposed to 297. And so, we'll see some, I think, significant increases for players like Monty Irvin, Larry Doby, Minnie Minoso, that I think may change a guy like Minnie Minoso in particular. Perhaps it will improve his chances now of getting in the Hall of Fame. I thought Minnie Minoso should have been in the Hall of Fame all along. Minnie Minoso, in respect and in essence, was the Latino Jackie Robinson. And Minnie Minoso was a great player in both the Negro Leagues and in the Major Leagues. And as I like to say, he put the go in the go White Sox. So
He
Minnie,
sure did.
Minnie should have been in the Hall of Fame all the time. But perhaps this will enhance his opportunity as well. And I think overall we'll see some give and take around the numbers, and it's really going to require those who know how to dive deep into the numbers, because the Negro Leagues sample sizes are not as large as Major League Baseball. Their seasons weren't as long. They didn't play as many games. And so you're talking about a limited number of games. And so Josh Gibson's home run totals may not seem as impressive surface level because they're only looking at league games. But when you delve into those numbers and you start to look at, oh, well, he was in the home run every, whatever it is, 12, 13 times at bat. Now, all of a sudden, those numbers become a whole lot more impressive. But then on the flip side of that, you look at his epic 1943 season where he hit 441. That's now likely to become the all-time single-season batting record. Or a guy like Artie Wilson, who we know was the last player in professional baseball to hit over 400. Artie Wilson hit over about 403 in 1948. That now moves, Ted Williams had done it, and we all kind of had Ted as the guy who was the last to do it. But now it is likely Artie Wilson. But even some of the other things that we talked about that are not necessarily statistical things, but famous first. Will the Negro Leagues now be given credit for having started night baseball? And some of these other advents that we talked about, the shin guards, the batting helmets. So it's more than just looking at the stats. But you know what? I tell people all the time that the stats for me are more contextual. They will help that person who really needs hardcore numbers to quantify just how good these players were. But they will never tell the true story of the Negro Leagues. And even within the stats themselves, it is going to be missing some element. Those stats are not going to tell you that J.L. Wilkinson bought an airplane in 1943 to hire Satchel Paige out to go pitch for other teams. It's not going to tell you that, and then fly back to join his Kansas City Monarchs. And so we have to take those stats for exactly what they are, contextual, and again, as a quantification to help those who need those numbers to verify just how great these players were.
Well, I'll tell you, I think the big winner, you've mentioned him already, is going to be Josh Gibson. True baseball fans who've done any looking around understand how great he was. But to maybe the casual baseball fan who's flipping through stats will suddenly realize that he hit for power like Ruth, and he hit for average like Cobb, and he caught all the time like Johnny Bench.
Yeah.
Like, the conversation on best player ever has to start with Josh Gibson.
Well, I tell you what, as Buck O'Neill would describe him, that he had the eyes of Ted Williams because he didn't strike out a lot. He put ball in play and put it in play with a lot of power. His outs, as they would say in our sport, were loud outs. As Buck would describe, the third baseman and the shortstop were damn near in left field when Gibson came to the plate. You're not creeping in on Josh. That was their version of a shift. Josh, if you want to bunt it, you can have it. And so he had the eyes of Ted Williams and the power of Babe Ruth rolled into one dynamic package. And it will be an awakening for a lot of baseball fans who may not have heard that name or certainly not understood, again, just how prolific he was. And as you mentioned, he was doing it as a catcher. And he wasn't a good catcher. He was a great catcher, rifle arm. He's throwing guys out from the crouch back in that era. And as Buck would again describe, that he had complete control of his pitching staff. So he called a great game, was a good running catcher, capable of stealing you 20, 25 bases or more to go with that big bat of his. And as I tell my guests, when I say big bat, man, I mean big bat. 40 ounce, 41 inches. And when you look at the pictures of Josh, he's not choking up on the bat. He's got it gripped down below the knob. Yeah, big, powerful forearms, big, powerful thighs, and great eyes. So, yeah, we are excited that people are going to be maybe more acute to the success and mega talent of a guy like Josh Gibson, who I think might be the greatest baseball player of all time. When you look at what he did playing the toughest position on the field, and he dominated both offensively and defensively. And if there's any such thing as a 5-2 catcher, it was Josh.
Yeah, it just, the things he does, you just shouldn't be able to do, right? That shouldn't exist.
Well, I tell people all the time, and people kind of want to get an understanding of his physique. I tell them, think Bo Jackson as a catcher. And that's Josh Gibson.
Yeah. I went to Detroit Tiger Fantasy Camp, and Mike Heath told me once that he wasn't afraid of blocking anybody at the plate except Bo Jackson. So now you got that guy out there. Thank you so much for your time. I don't want to take much more, but I do have just two more quick things to ask you. You talk about the stats and the stories. How important are the stories and the storytelling for people to understand not just the Negro Leagues, but history in general?
I think it's extremely important, man. I don't ever want the stories to die, Craig. That's why I said the stats are contextual. These stories should live on forever. I'm proud to be in that pipeline of people who are considered to be storytellers, trying to keep the stories of the Negro Leagues alive. Most of what we learned about the Negro Leagues was through oral histories. And the likes of Monty Irvin and Minnie Minoso and Buck O'Neill, who I was blessed to be around, and Ernie Banks and these guys who were Negro League contemporaries who shared this information with me. And now I get to share with people. I don't ever want that to die. I really don't. I tell people all the time, Babe Ruth was Major League Baseball's Paul Bunyan. Josh Gibson was Negro League Baseball's John Henry. And I want John Henry to live on forever. This hard hammering man. So no, those stories are vitally important. And much of what we know about African American history was done so through oral storytelling. Your grandparents set you down at their feet and they told you. Somebody set you down and said, man, let me tell you about these ball players you should have seen. And that is how that tradition was kept alive. I don't ever want to lose that. And the Negro Leagues Museum is that voice, it's that vehicle for these great stories. And we want these stories to live on forever.
And you do a great job of pushing out those stories. I mean, you don't have to get to Kansas City to enjoy what's going on with the Negro League Baseball Museum. What are some of the ways that people can enjoy your stories?
Yeah, well, right now I'm doing a podcast called Black Diamonds in partnership with my friends over at Sirius XM Radio. We launched this podcast in April of this year. And I'll be honest, I am absolutely shocked at the success of this podcast. It has really, really taken off. And we're doing exactly what you and I are doing today. We're telling stories, but we're telling stories in long form fashion. And my friends over at Sirius have done such a great job of producing these. And we get to examine so many different aspects of the Negro Leagues. And I tell people these stories are too good. You can't make them up. They're too good. That and as Buck O'Neill would say, you don't have to fictionalize Negro Leagues baseball to make it entertaining. Just tell the real story. It is entertaining in its own right. And so that is one way. Late last summer, we did a project with a local firm here called Pro Athlete called Storied. 22 stories of the Negro Leagues in 22 weeks. And we literally, in a span of about 2.5, 3 hours, they came in to the museum, turned the cameras on and said, Bob, start telling stories. And we put this series together, digital content series, as we were moving through the pandemic. People were looking for ways they couldn't necessarily get to the Negro Leagues Museum. So we started creating this digital content and people really responded. And it became a highly anticipated series. Everybody was looking every week to see what was new coming out, and they were following these 22 stories. And then we went into extra innings with them and put together, 5 or 6 more different stories that weren't included in the initial release. And so, we're creating these opportunities. Of course, we're using our website, our social media kind of network. And of course, you follow me on Instagram at NLB Imprez, Twitter, the same username, the museum at NLB Museum KC, which is also the same for both Twitter and Instagram. And so we're using those vehicles to tell stories as well. And we just partnered just last week with Major League Baseball and Major League Baseball Players Association on a social media strategy, releasing 101 facts about the Negro League in celebration of Negro Leagues 101, the 101st anniversary of the birth of the Negro League.
Well, listen, I've listened to the podcast. I love it. I watched all 22 stories. I love them. And I can't say enough about how wonderful it is to hear those stories, to know that they're out there. I can't say enough about what a wonderful storyteller you are and how much I enjoy listening to you. And I can't tell you how frustrating it was as a baseball fan to see that the museum was closed last year on its 100th anniversary.
Yeah.
And you had the big tip of the cap campaign. I bought this cap at the Negro League Museum, the Homestead Grays, and I'm just going to take my time to tip off the cap to you and to the museum and to the great work you're doing. I really appreciate the time you spent with me today. Really appreciate everything you're doing. And I think it's not just important for baseball. I think it's really important for what's going on in the world right now, where history is being denied to people who don't want you to know. It's going to be hard to for them not to find out when you're doing the kind of things you're doing, Bob. Thank you so much for your time.
Craig, it's my absolute pleasure, man. Thanks again for having me.
You bet. I hope we get to do it again sometime.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Are you a storyteller who wants to tell the story of how you tell stories? Yes? Then I want to hear from you. Drop me a line at craig@colbyvision.net and tell me a little bit about yourself, your career, and some of the particulars of your process. Colby Vision is a storytelling company working in the broadcasting and the business world. Send me an email if you need help with either. Thanks to Tim Vesely for the music, and Kevin Francisco for the graphics, and Dave White for the editing. And thanks to you for watching Narrative Drive Time.